hour with housing. Thank my colleagues for being here. Can we dispense with continuing item number 3? Can we do that now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So can we move to continue item number 3? So moved? So moved. Objections? That's the order.
That brings us to item number 1, which is a verbal update from the Housing Department relative to HCID's tracking and monitoring owner and tenant outreach, funding assistance, prioritization, and preservation efforts of the city's at-risk assisted affordable housing.
Right. So I want to thank Larry Gross for bringing this matter to my attention, being a strong advocate that he is, constantly reminding me, although it's arguable, I won't quite concede yet that we can't build our way out of it, but it's arguable and definitely challenging that we do face the risk of losing affordability, and that the maintenance of affordability has to be a priority of this committee and of this department. And I know that there's a series of strategies for us to do that, and we want to hear from our new, congratulations, our new permanent director of housing. But it's a real challenge for us because as we try to meet the needs that are part of the housing crisis, we have to constantly pay concurrent attention to the challenges for special needs housing and for affordability. And that's what confronts us today. We're at risk of losing thousands and thousands of units. My district happens to be at the top of that list, so fortunately, we're here today to begin to listen about ways forward and then lay out a plan to do that. So, Rush?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This is obviously a very important topic, and thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this with you. We have with us this afternoon to discuss some specifics is Helmi Hizrick, Assistant General Manager of our major projects, as well as Franklin Campos, who is monitors all of our at-risk projects, and we'll get into the specifics.
Yes.
And what we're going to be discussing this afternoon is specific to at-risk projects, that is specifically those that have covenants that are expiring. What's not before you this afternoon will be the rent stabilization ordinance units, which is approximately 638,000 units, and that's a separate discussion that we'll have to just really discuss and dive in deeply in how we can, as a city, can try to amend the Ellis Act, which is the guiding principle for the RSO, so that we can make it more difficult for property owners to remove those units from the rental market. That's become a major issue as we see the markets slowly get more robust. We're starting to see more and more properties being Ellis. So that's something we're going to bring before this committee as well as to discuss ways to address that. We also have to look at areas of preservation of permanent sort of housing as we look at single SRO buildings, SRO units, and how we as a city and as a region are addressing the homeless issue. We've shifted slowly, but in the right direction. Housing first. We're putting homeless individuals, those that are chronically homeless, into housing, and with that, there's additional costs and expenses associated with that. So, there's a number of different fronts we need to look at, and that we'll be discussing with this committee. What we have as far as a presentation for you this afternoon is specifically of those projects that have covenants associated with them, whether it be Section 8, CRA covenants, or tax credits, or home covenants that are expiring in various levels that we monitor very closely, and then give you a sample of what we do to monitor them and what our strategies are to be able to address them on a go-forward basis, specifically those that are the CRA properties that we recently received, which was a huge dump of units, which they've been in existence, but there's some serious issues that we have in the near future that we need to address, and we need to work closely with the committee and the council to try to address and come up with strategies to be able to save as many of those units as we possibly can. So with that, I'll turn it over to Franklin, who will tee up just kind of the framework of where we are with those properties, and then Helmi will present what we're doing on a go-forward basis.
Good afternoon, council members. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this very important and timely issue. As Rush mentioned, part of my responsibilities include the various non-financing efforts to preserve at-risk housing, tracking the affordable units. On April 9th, the HCLA presented to you the challenges and approaches to address the affordable housing crisis at the local level. That presentation focused largely on addressing the affordable housing stock through local funding sources for new affordable housing construction. We're here to present to you about investing in safeguarding and extending the preservation of at-risk affordable housing. I will provide you with an overview of the non-financial initiatives such as tracking, monitoring, owner and outreach and education that we have been conducting over the last 10 years. And Helmi will go over, as Raj said, go over the funding assistance, prioritization, and other financing options to preserve the housing. Next, please. Just to give you a quick overview of the housing inventory in the city, so it's about 1.4 million. Out of that, 62% is all multifamily housing. Next slide, please. When we're talking about affordable housing, from that 62%, the 880,000 units, approximately 8% of the entire multifamily portfolio is what we call affordable. While the production of new affordable housing is critical, so is the preservation of existing affordable housing in the city. So you can see that there's only 8% is located across the city, mostly owned. Our estimates indicate that mostly are owned by private entities, and it's a layering of different financing and rental assistance sources. As you can see, it's very limited. So we're looking at approximately 60,000 affordable units in about 1,900 developments. So it's a layering of different properties with different restrictions, which I'll go into more detail in a minute. One of the things that I'll be pointing out later on is that these are homes to many of the city's poorest and vulnerable residents, but also that the inventory and a one-sheet paper was sent to you. Actually, you already seen it, which it describes the breakdown of the different types of programs in the city. And so you see that a lot of these units are always constantly being at risk. There's some that go through renewal mechanisms, which I'll explain, and some of the other ones basically there's no renewal mechanism tied to them, and they just simply expire. So when we're talking about the 8% of those units, we're talking about a mix of income restricted and rent subsidized programs. That's why you will hear covenanted or rental subsidized. Is when, for the income restricted, is when owners use a combination of public subsidies, conventional loans to develop housing that are affordable to low-income families in return for public financing. Affordable rent restrictions are placed on all units, and in some cases, just few units. When it comes to the rent subsidized, in most cases, which recently that's mostly the case now, most of those properties only have a rental assistance contract. And why it's important to track the ones that have rental assistance contract, and I'm talking about HUD project-based Section 8, so a contract is attached to the building to provide low-income rent, is because why it's important is because they're targeting those are the most subsidized units, which are tied to the adjusted gross income for each of the residents, for the family. Next, please. So as I mentioned, today we're focusing on the preservation of this public assisted inventory. The preservation of affordable housing can be achieved through various methods. And in the last years, the way our department has been doing this is through non-financial and also financing mechanisms. Non-financing mechanisms includes the tracking of the existing inventory. As you have seen some of those numbers, and that's what we've been doing over the last 10 years. Other methods include advocacy, such as meeting with different groups, and you'll probably hear from some of them, which are our partners in working to different groups to actually discuss some of these issues, look at policies, but also look at the project level as to what's happening with each of the buildings. And outreach and education, which is very important for owners and also for project owners to inform them of their rights and responsibilities. And also, that could also be achieved by a combination of what I just mentioned, but also, in the end, it's also retention and extension of rental subsidies and restrictions. And in the end, it's also financing, which Helmi is going to talk a little bit more about. Next. So, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about what is at-risk affordable housing, we consider at-risk affordable housing if a property has received any type of government assistance or there's any rental type of incentive that was provided at the federal, state, and local level. And what we look at, and we follow the state definition for tax credits, which is any of those properties that have any type of rental assistance or restriction that is going to expire within the next 5 years. Whether that might be through a termination of a covenant, a maturity of a HUD-assisted mortgage, or the expiration of use restrictions, or a combination. In most cases, with the HUD properties, is a termination of those rental assistance contracts. And for the most part, for the city restricted, is a expiration of a covenant. Next, please. So this gives you a picture of the citywide at-risk expiring inventory within the next 5 years. So when you look at what the inventory, as I mentioned, we're looking at about 1,800 properties, about 69,000 units. When you look at the inventory, and the way we track this is through an affordable housing database and an internal database that we have been able to layer all the different types of subsidies and restrictions. Most of the inventory as of now is under the local, then followed by the state, and then by the federal. But when you look at the properties that are expiring in the next 5 years, you'll see a different picture in terms of the numbers. And you're looking at most of the properties that we have that are expiring in the next 5 years are federally assisted. And what that means is that you're looking at most of the properties that are under the federally subsidized in that category actually are on an annual renewal basis. So contracts usually are renewed 1, 5, or 20 years. So right now what we're capturing is most of those are expiring within 1 and 5 years. And so some of those properties, owners would decide to terminate.
Are these contracts tied to the person or to the building?
This contract is tied to the building. The ones that are tied to the tenant are the tenant-based Section 8, which is administered by HACLA. So these are contracts between property owners and HUD. And so when we're looking at these projects, they would constantly be at risk. Some of them would terminate if the owner decides to terminate. The others will actually renew. We'll probably go back, let's say, from the ones that are expiring in next year, are probably moving into 2016. And some of those might not even be included in this portfolio because they're going to be renewing for more than 5 years. So what I'm trying to say that is mostly owner-driven when it comes to all of the at-risk properties. We have some leverage if there's some financing attached to it or any other type of program and resources allocated to keep on tracking this type of housing. When you're looking at what this shows is 15,000 units. It's very alarming, but most of it falls under the federal. But when we're looking at the local housing,
So what would be the federal our response to that challenge?
The response to the challenge actually has been working in partnership with HUD, also with our outreach consultant, and also with the different organizations that make up what we call as the Los Angeles Preservation Working Group, to start coming up with different ideas and different methods to work with owners, provide outreach and education. In some cases, they don't know that there's renewal options. And also try to work with HUD. In the end, it's actually about financing and trying to see how there's some sort of way that those buildings could actually be preserved long-term for an owner to possibly sell to a nonprofit or a for-profit that's going to keep it affordable. And in the process, adding different types of restrictions, which will probably be coming from any other type of financing, such as tax credits or bond financing. So that would be the way to tackle that.
I can jump in a little bit.
Yeah, please.
First of all, I think it's very important to understand that very few cities have a database of all the expiring covenants and rent restrictions. So the fact that we have a by address, the ability to know by address everything that is at risk, is unique among cities. In terms of the HUD covenants, we're tracking, not covenants, the HUD project-based rental assistance. We may or may not be party to those contracts, so we may not have any direct role. And the way that we've been working with HUD is we've partnered with HUD, we've met with them to share underwriting and to figure out how to basically make it easy for a property owner that has a rental assistance to renew. One of the things that they generally are doing is doing what's called mark-to-market, where they take their contracts, the fair market rents, to the current market levels. So if they had a contract that was set years ago at lower rent levels and they want to mark them up to a higher rent level, we'll assist in underwriting if it requires a bond deal to do a renovation. So really what we've been trying to do is partner with HUD and streamline financing decisions. We've worked on, subordinating our loan documents to HUD and things like that getting out of the way of the transaction and enabling it to move forward. The other way to deal with that is really what Franklin has been talking about, which is outreaching to both the property owners and very importantly to the tenants, to make sure the tenants know their rights in the event of a contract expiration, because they do have rights. And so that enables the tenants to keep their relationship with HUD and their rent levels consistent with what they had, and it also requires all of the property owners to follow all of the law that is in place to ensure appropriate outreach to the tenants, etc. So it's really just the outreach component does have a big effect on preserving those units.
And one of the things that Helmi mentioned is the with regards to the federal, there is tenant protections when it comes to an expiration. Well, on the other hand, with the local, if there's no rental subsidy tied to it, with the layering, basically most of them don't have. Basically, the project would just terminate, and then that's where other restrictions or other protections will probably kick in if there are any. And in this case, you could see that most of the properties at the local level are actually former CRA projects that the department inherited. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. And the rest is just state loans that the state made with no other type of restriction.
I want to add one thing that I think also doesn't jump out at you is on those HUD contracts, one of the ways a bad actor landlord tries to exit a contract is simply by allowing a property to deteriorate. And when it gets so bad, HUD will actually will say you cannot have a tenant HUD contract in that unit. And so it's by having the registry that we have the financing team and the code enforcement team and the outreach team all working together. And we actually have gone in and code enforced to ensure that properties can't deteriorate as a way of getting out of affordable housing contracts.
And usually that happens in coordination with the team of sending, if there's a property that it has notified us that's going to terminate within a year as required, we'll go ahead and send our inspectors out there just to make sure that if indeed that's going to happen, that the units are in compliance. And also, we also look for other issues that might be happening at the building. This is...
So we're keeping pretty much up to date on that? Are we behind in review of those cases? Is there a backlog?
No, I mean, once, not a lot of the projects are actively notifying that's happening, but then when it comes to rent control, I mean, the systematic code enforcement that's being done continuously over for many years.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I pointed it out only to demonstrate that there is coordination between our units. We don't have a lot of those situations arise.
Mr. Chair, I have a question on that point. How is that sort of monitoring sort of paid for? I mean, so I know that I imagine that it's sort of fee or penalty based in building and safety, but how do you all pay for those sort of that monitoring capability?
The monitoring of these units?
Right. So you said that there's a perverse incentive to maybe let some of these units get out of sort of HUD standards of sort of residency, and that there's the opportunity to sort of now make them less, or rather take them off the affordable sort of side of things. How is it that you're coordinating with other sort of departments and divisions through the city, but how does the Housing Community Investment Department pay for that sort of service, that monitoring?
Occupancy monitoring.
Well,
Is it general fund?
Well, actually, this database work was done through a Macarthur Grant, and we received a grant which the policy team went after specifically to enable us to create a database so that we could monitor. We have a variety of different ways of monitoring. If we have affordable covenants that the department has placed on it, we do that through occupancy monitoring. So we have a team that monitors where we have covenants. Where we don't have covenants, where it's a HUD contract, that's what's getting monitored by the MacArthur-funded database program.
But the level of monitoring differs depending on sort of the type of sort of circumstance you have, some with covenants, some without. And so you're doing it with grants, and some of it you're doing with your sort of operating...
The answer specifically to your question, Councilman, the staff within the department is a combination of various grant funds, primarily CDBG and home admin dollars. And as Helmy indicated, we do have the Macarthur Grant Foundation is also helping us as well to help augment the shortage of staffing.
Great, thank you.
This slide actually points as to what the risks are. So we were talking about the different types of properties. So you're looking at most of the HUD projects in red. About 50% the risk is actually prepayment or maturity or actually termination of those contracts what we're talking. The CRA basically is the expiration of restrictions and also other types of covenants. And for the most part, you'll see that there's about other 20 programs that are in the 14%, the yellow piece over there, that are a combination of different types of programs that are also at risk of terminating. Next slide, please. This is just to, and I think you already have it with you, just to give you and point out to where and how many properties are there, and also affordable units in the city.
Isn't that expiring covenants at risk?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's what's expiring in the next 5 years.
In the next 5 years. Thank you.
Leading.
Why preserve at-risk affordable housing? Well, we talked about the 8%, so there's not that many in the city. So, and then we have all these risks, some of them which we have more control over the others. And I mean, we talked about how there's the deepest affordability and also they're more, I mean, preservation is more cost-effective than the new construction. So we need to preserve what's there and also stabilizes neighborhoods. And in the end, it also prevents displacement in many cases where we don't have any other recourse on preserving the housing. Okay. So we're mentioning the non-financial preservation initiatives. In 2004, the Council and Mayor's Office created what is known as the Affordable Housing Preservation Program. And these are the non-financial initiatives like the tracking, the working with different owners, tenants, the different other groups that are out there working on preservation. And this unit, actually, very small unit, is housed in the HCLA Public Policy and Research Unit. So with limited resources, it was created to move the city from the crisis management to the crisis prevention. In 2009, the city received a $1 million grant from the Macarthur Foundation. And it was given to, back then, the former LAHD and also the former CRA. And the grant to the LHD was actually provided to assist in the implementation of the affordable housing preservation, a non-financial piece. And so throughout, actually over the last 5 years, with that grant, we have been able to improve the coordination with other city financing agencies. Before it was a CRA, now it's only HSID, but also enhance the at-risk affordable housing data and the tracking and the strategies, and also implement and help expand the outreach and education component. And that has been over the last 5 years for our grant. And later on, we'll talk about a new grant to do that. But one thing to mention is that the grant is actually going to be expiring next year. So that's what's been keeping a lot of the efforts, non-financial efforts, moving forward. And now Helmi is going to talk about the financial piece, and I'll go back and talk about the new strategies within the Macarthur Grant.
Okay, I already mentioned a little bit about the first one, which is the federal programs. Those are primarily project-based Section 8 contracts that are on one-year time horizons. And we have...
So they're constantly on 1 year?
Well, what we want is to see them renew for, up to 25 years. We want to see longer-term renewals, but a lot of times they can go for a year. And that's why those are considered at risk, because their contracts are expiring every year. So sort of every year they can be at risk, a large number of the HUD contracts. What the role we've played...
How do we get that to the 25?
Well, it's working with HUD and working with those property owners, trying to reach out to those property owners and also to encourage them to extend those contracts. Generally, it's a market decision for them. It's is it the right thing financially to do? And our role is to really partner with HUD, because HUD becomes the primary subsidy source in these transactions because it's the contract. And what sometimes becomes problematic is the underwriting by HUD and the underwriting by our department and also by the state have sometimes it hasn't been efficient, and it hasn't always had the same, we don't always have the same terms. And so what we've done is we've reached out to HUD to sit down with them, and we've been working on expediting the underwriting so that when they do go into marking up to market, for example, we can actually push those projects through on an expeditious manner. They don't take a long time and draw out for a long time to finance. So it's really making the financing easy.
When I see feds and local, I don't see the state.
Well, the state kind of the state has much fewer at risk right now. We have much fewer numbers of units at risk from the state. And expiring tax credits really is the state piece. And in that case, when the tax credits expire, we separate out projects preservation. We do a lot of preservation using our bond program for 20-year expiring tax credits. So when a tax credit reaches year 15, the property has to stay affordable for 20 years, and then they can come back and refinance with new tax credits. So there's an opportunity after year 20 to refi, or what we call recapitalization. And we're seeing a lot of those come in because the tax credit program is starting to have a lot of projects were built 20 years ago, and we divide up the preservation into what we call big P and little p. And big P is when you have a recapitalization or a project that's coming back for refinancing where the credits are about to expire. So if they were 20-year affordability covenants set that are about to expire, those are, pushed to the front of the line. We want to recapitalize those quickly. The projects that we call little p are when you have your tax credits expiring after 20 years, but the covenant restrictions were, say, 30 or 55 years. So the urgency from the covenant standpoint is not as much of a crisis. We do a lot of those anyway, and when we refi those deals, we also extend the covenants another 55 years. So it is preservation, and it's important work. It's just not crisis work. Luckily, we can usually do that in a more normal atmosphere. What we do on our bond program is just push those ones that are having urgent expiring covenants to the front. So we try to do the big P preservation. And then the last piece, which is right in the middle, the local at risk, is the majority of those, about 4,000 units, a little over 4,000, about 4,200 actually, are from CRA. Those are expiring in the next 5 years. And many of those, the CRA went in and purchased affordability, and they may not have any loan. We might not have a loan or any kind of mechanism or contractual relationship. And so when those expire, they're just expired. And so what that actually leads us into what we're currently working on with our Macarthur Grant, which Franklin can talk a little bit more about, which is a very targeted effort to come up with a strategy to address the CRA portfolio. And we will be coming back to you with recommendations. We don't know the amount of money it takes at this point to address those properties, but we're going to come back to you with some policy recommendations.
Mr. Chair, on that, with the CRA properties, because that's a tranche there that seems, unless you tell me the federal is sort of tougher than this one. So when we bought when the city of Los Angeles bought the affordability in those units, was it sort of with cash into the deal through the redevelopment tax increment financing? Is that how we got the developers to do the affordability?
I think actually I don't know the whole history of them, but
I'm sure it's project by project, but by and large, is that fair to say?
It looks like a lot of them were not even tax credit projects. They just went into a building and purchased covenants. So I'm going to go buy affordability and establish, in this 60-unit building, I'm going to take 30 of those units, pay the owner to establish a covenant. And those covenants are near the end of their useful life.
So there were actual covenants.
They're covenants.
Yeah, you had to have those. And so there was, and it's not meant to pick on the CRA, but sort of what was the long-term thinking back then? I realize that you're HCID and not CRA, but what was the thinking in terms of when there was expiration to those covenants? Was the thinking that the goodwill of the project would sort of continue? Or
I don't know the whole history. I can tell you what I think happened, and at this point I really don't know if this is accurate, but at one point the CRA had not produced anywhere near enough affordable housing and was responding to a legal challenge on that front, and had cash available in a Bunker Hill lawsuit, which was funds generated by the redevelopment of Bunker Hill. And in the process of taking that Bunker Hill money, they went out citywide create affordable housing citywide with that funding. The quickest way to create the affordable housing was to actually purchase affordability in existing properties and to set those as affordable. So it was really a strategy to move very quickly and not go through a low-income housing tax credit financing process. So it was probably an excellent strategy at the time to preserve affordability, but it was 30 years ago. So,
and I ask because I'm wondering if there aren't any clues there to help us figure out how to induce the projects that are about to expire to see what sort of what we can do. But I guess that's you all are thinking.
Well, we should talk a little bit about
Yeah.
the Macarthur Grant. Do you want to talk about? Why don't we skip ahead to that one? Yeah.
So in expressing their satisfaction with what had been accomplished over the last 5 years, the Macarthur Foundation awarded the department with the remaining funds that were given to the CRA since it was dissolved, and actually were provided to HCID to focus on the expiring CRA portfolio. The grant initiatives were approved last month, actually, by council and the mayor. And so the additional funds make up the $1 million grant investment that they had made. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking and we're going to be identifying financial and non-financial strategies within that. So we have hired a consultant to do that and to go through the inventory with us and also start focusing on those types of financing strategies and to come up with the to come up with a decision-making framework for us to start categorizing the different types of properties. There's some properties that we might have more leverage because they probably owe us some money. There's some other ones that simply will probably just expire, and there's a few that they're less than 10, 20 units. And so we'll be doing that. And at the same time, we're also going to be focusing on targeted outreach and education to tenants that lived on those properties, so that those categories will allow us to identify which buildings we're going to send out the outreach contractor at the same time. Also, at the same time, what we have done already is communicate with those owners of properties. And what I'm talking about is the properties are going to be expiring in the next 5 years, but we're focusing on the ones that are expiring next year. So we had already outreach to approximately 130 property owners of the properties that are expiring and informing them of the different types of options and also the different types of requirements that they have under state law to notify the tenants, to notify the city as to what their intentions are going to be. So we're starting to get responses right now. But then we're in the next few weeks, so in the next week actually, we're going full force in implementing the grant initiative
Yeah, we'll be sorting the properties into different types. If it's owned by a nonprofit, affordable, mission-driven owner, it's easier. We can enter into a discussion about refinancing. If it's got, if it could potentially be sold to a mission-driven affordable housing owner, that might be an approach trying to encourage a sale. If there's a rent stabilization ordinance in place, we may be able to ensure that at least the current tenants can stay in place under the RSO. So we're going to look at all the different sort of strategies and put them in buckets and figure out, what are our highest priority. The pressure points will be in areas that are gentrifying quickly. Those will be the ones that will be focusing on probably with the highest priority. In some areas, the affordable rents and the market rents are not that far apart, and so there may be less pressure we might find it easier, I should say, to extend covenants there. But again, we're in the process of analyzing this with the help of a consultant and coming up with an approach and recommending how much funding in the trust fund would be required to support this work.
And I just may want to add here that we are going to be coming back to this committee in the next couple of weeks with some options, policy issues, and options for this committee and council ultimately to make relative to our managed pipeline as to how we want to allocate our limited resources on a go-forward basis. Now, as you know, we've got 31 projects in our pipeline right now, but it's important to have the discussion about what are our priorities on a go-forward basis, whether it be strictly TOD, whether it be geographic apportionment, whether it be all veterans, But also part of that discussion is about what are we going to do about the preservation project. So as we get, say, for instance, boomerang funds or other source of monies that become available, we'll have this teed up as well so that we'll have different options by which how we want to allocate either through the trust fund or if there's other resources that come in, we can have dedicated resources that come through the trust fund dedicated for such projects such as preservation, looking at the CRA properties because that's obviously a far cheaper way to preserve affordable housing than create brand new projects, which is running about $365,000 per unit. So it's, we've got to look at both those options and have a robust conversation on both ends. So at the very least, we'll be back in a couple of weeks to discuss the specific policy matters relative to the trust fund, but that spills over into discussions like this to contemplate future funding options as they come available.
You didn't mention cap and trade.
That would be one of the funding options. Prop 41 dollars for veteran homeless, the cap and trade dollars, boomerang funds, a variety of potential sources of monies as they become available.
Would that be the best use of boomerang? What other uses could we have with boomerang?
Well, for us, from our perspective, that has been primarily looking at preservation projects, in particular, because obviously you look at the host of the number of projects that are potentially going to be going market rate, and it's far cheaper for the city to be able to extend those covenants than it is to build new. That is by far the cheapest way to go. And I'm not suggesting we put all our money into that basket because we need to have a balanced approach to ensure that we continue to have a robust economic growth and construction as well. So it's a balancing approach and making sure that we're achieving our long-term vision to preserve what we have while also continuing the growth of new construction.
Colleagues?
So this is, obviously complicated stuff here, and just help me understand sort of, if I zoomed out to the 30,000-foot level here, we've got roughly about 8% of the housing stock out there is affordable, about 62,000 and change. 15,000 and change here looks like is at risk in the next 5 years, so 25% of the housing is at risk to expire in 5 years, and you've got three tranches. You've got the federal housing, which I'm sorry if I didn't catch it, but there's what is sort of the strategy to try to figure out how to preserve those 9,000 and change units?
It's outreach, and it's working with HUD on the underwriting of project-based Section 8.
So that is, if I had to sort of categorize easy to hard, probably the easier one to deal with because we're dealing with our partners at HUD and they're aligned with our mission.
Well, it's a business decision for the property owners as well. As long as there's enough incentive for them not to go market rate, absolutely.
And that's largely sort of HUD's got the ability to provide that incentive
within the framework that they have to make deals.
And so then the tougher tranche, it looks like.
I would just say I don't actually think it's easier. I think it's a different approach and maybe a less expensive approach if we can do it right. But I think it's actually challenging, and I don't think HUD is as on the ground as this Housing and Community Investment Department is with respect to tracking and outreach. I think we are very much pushing that agenda.
And so my question for each of those three tranches, and we'll start with the federal one, is what is it that we can be doing to either sweeten the pot or make it so that we're successful in convincing those property owners to maintain the affordability, realizing it's HUD's charge by and large, but
Right.
it's our housing element that it counts against. What's our sort of our angle with that part of it, that tranche?
It's really better collaboration with HUD to understand what the implications are if these projects do go to market, considering they understand just like we do that this is a market-driven, a business decision on their part. We need them to be able to step up the plate to help the second largest city in the United States to be able to ensure that we've got affordable housing. And we've all seen the various studies where the most expensive place to live in the country.
Sure.
And HUD has to have this on their radar screen as well. So it's incumbent upon us to work with HUD to make sure that they're helping the city in that manner.
And the CRA sort of tranche, according to this chart, it's about 4,100 units, roughly 25% of the 25% of the 8% that's at risk here, right? Is my math sort of goofy or right? That seems really difficult because we don't have any more money to sort of throw at getting the covenants and creating the guarantee for amount of time. Is there anything that we can do here as a council sort of in the short term? I know that you're coming back with some recommendations, but is there any sort of financing mechanisms that we can be sort of pursuing here to try to for lack of better words, throw additional money to buy those covenants?
Well, that may be the short-term and long-term solution. We need to come back to you with the analysis that we're working with our consultant on. We're going to do this on a rolling basis. We don't want to wait for the consultant to go through the whole bank of projects before we come back to you at middle part of next year and say, okay, now we've got the solution, but we've only got a couple of months left. So
Right.
we're going to do this fairly early on, come back to this committee and say, this is the trends we're seeing, and I think that this is the time that we need to, we'll come up with several options, one of which may be buying down those units to continue the affordability. And again, looking at the trade-off between the creation of new affordable housing versus that of continuing the covenants, that may be a better option for us.
And I want to commend you for sort of doing I think it's sort of hard to call it an early alert, because I know that you all have been doing this now for many, many years, but those projects, to me, the CRA sort of batch or tranche seems like the really, really tough one, given that Harvard study that says that affordability now is, it takes 43% of people's salaries to be able to maintain a home, a house, a roof over their heads. There seems to be very little to no incentive to want to sort of preserve the affordability and sort of quickly go to market rate. And I don't know if that's sort of too simple of a way of looking at it, but it seems like we're going to have to throw a lot of resources into any of those property owners to be able to maintain the affordability. So just wondering out loud, and it's not a criticism of the CRA, but it's, given sort of what's at risk, it seems like a small, it's 25% of what's at risk right now, and albeit it's a lot of units, is there any thought about sort of trying to use whatever resources are going to be recommended to be used into the production of new housing to have more of a sustainable model? Because here, albeit 30 years was good, how do we sort of maintain the second sort of 30-year installment? I just don't see how we're going to do that, given what the market conditions look like out there.
Well, affordable housing has changed quite a bit over the last 30 years. We now establish 55-year covenants on all of our projects, and our projects are, especially the low-income housing tax credit model, we do a 55-year covenant, and I think with the ability to recapitalize or refinance in year 20, when you still have a term of affordability, it gives the project the ability to come back in and refinance and continue to extend the affordability. So I think that model is a good model and doesn't put us into this crisis situation. That said, we always are looking for strategies. So, for example, if there's an opportunity to purchase covenants, to do a buy-down of covenants, sometimes that's a much more cost-effective per unit way to go. And, I think we would be looking at having longer-term covenants at a minimum.
And it seems to me that the Tax Credit Allocation Authority, again, tremendous, the sharpest sort of arrow in our quiver here. It seems that has to have sort of some cap as to how much recapitalization we can do. What is that number? I don't know if it's an annual basis, or is there, because it's not as if we can sort of just refinance every deal out there. There's only so much that we can do. How much is it that we can do?
I'm sorry, I don't know our bond cap
I don't know
off the top
capacity.
of my head. We're way under what we are allowed to do. What we have is our cap. Other cities, such as New York, do considerably more, and they have issues of hitting their cap. But Los Angeles, at this point, we don't hit our cap.
Whatever that number is probably not enough. Given
Probably
sort of the need, right?
Yeah.
So is there a way for us to expand that number? What is it that we can do? Because you're going to be in the business real soon of recapitalizing a lot of projects, and ideally we hit that cap. How do we sort of start expanding our capacity?
I think we first start with hitting our cap, and in addition to that, we're always offered cap for the unutilized cap from around the state. So there's always that option, but you first demonstrate utilization of all of your cap, and as well as taking additional cap before you start asking for more. So it really goes back to us as to really working these deals and pushing the recap policy.
But I'm anticipating that you're going to hit that cap.
Yes.
You have to, and you probably are not going to have enough capacity to meet sort of what's eligible to be sort of.
We want to get to that problem. I'm sorry, I don't know the number off the top of my head. I don't want to venture a guess. It's over $1 billion. But we're not even close to hitting our cap. So as soon as we're getting close, we'll come back.
Well, to me, it'd be, I think, helpful to sort of understand in all of those three tranches, well, probably not the federal one, it's going to be the CRA one and the tax credit deals that are out there, how much of that is sort of vetted to be eligible for that recapitalization opportunity,
Right.
and then understand how fast we can do that, because to me, that's going to be probably the largest tool that we have to be
Well,
able to...
I would say we're the largest municipal bond issuer in the state of California. So the city of Los Angeles issues more housing bonds than any city by a long shot. What our biggest limitation is in terms of the bond program is, sort of velocity and capacity of staff. We don't have enough staff to hit our bond cap, frankly. I think if we were to focus on anything, it would be on how do we expand and streamline our bond program in a way that enables us to move faster on these transactions and do more of them.
Yeah, it's important to note also, though, the recapitalization with those bonds is that the covenants already are longer than that of the term when they're recapitalizing. So in some instances, certainly going with the bond refinancing is applicable. Not always, because what we're coming across now are the covenants where they're longer term than that of the loans. They've already been paid off. So now it's just a matter of you're dealing with a property owner that now it's just I can go to market rate. I don't owe you anything. So what's the incentive to me? So that's the big tranche that we've got to address. Certainly bonds is one answer, but many times there's no cash in it for them other than what are we going to bring to the table to make it incentivize it for them.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you for sort of the overview. It's helpful, informative, but alarming all the same, right? Because it sort of demonstrates what needs to be done. And then when you look at the numbers, it's still not enough. And that's sort of the hard part to swallow here. So I appreciate your efforts. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Who's our consultant on this?
CHPC.
There's two consultants. Is the Coalition for Economic Survival. They've been contracted to do the tenant average indication, and also the California Housing Partnership Corporation is going to be doing the analysis on the CRA portfolio.
Repeat the second part.
The California Housing Partnership Corporation, CHPC, they're going to be working on the analysis of the portfolio.
Great.
Yeah. So they're on board.
Mr. Price.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Second.
Thank you for the report. It is exciting yet fearful, I think. The one-year initiative by the Macarthur Foundation sounds like it's going to be very helpful, though.
Yes, very much needed.
Trying to create a framework for what's out there,
Right.
and hopefully a model that we can use going forward. And while we've had a couple of cases already in the 9th that we're refinancing some of these housing projects, I think it just speaks to the desirability of focusing or working with community-based nonprofits that have a mission to provide affordable housing. Because those are the ones that are going to be most likely to continue doing it, as opposed to deciding they're going to change and flip and do something else. And so I think just another reason to work with them and to provide the kind of incentives, for community-based nonprofits that
Right.
are doing affordable housing.
Right. And we'd agreed that we would come back with our recapitalization policies, and we would discuss flow of funds to help the nonprofit organizations on a go-forward basis, and coming up with that balance between making sure that they're in a position where they can continue their core mission, while certainly making sure the city is made whole to the best extent, so we can get the best of both worlds.
Exactly. Yeah. Good luck. Thanks, Shelley.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have any cards on item?
I don't know.
Yes, we do.
There's cards on item.
Bring up you want to talk to the two consultants?
Oh, I don't know if they can help. Unless they have money.
Let's bring them up for a minute. What time is it? Mr. Gross, you want to join us for a second? And Paul Wiesemeyer?
So my name's Larry Gross. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Economic Survival, and we've been working with the Housing Department on these preservation issues for nearly 3 decades now, mainly doing the tenant outreach and education. And Housing Department's current Affordable Housing Preservation Program is extremely important, and not only is it crucial to support it, but we need to expand it. Councilmember Fuentes, your summary was totally accurate in the potential tidal wave that we're seeing on the horizon. And we really need to be creative in addressing this crisis. The CRA units present a greater challenge, as you've heard. There's no tenant protections at the time of restrictions expiring, and they're unlikely to be covered by rent control because when they were built is past the exemption date, and really big money is needed to preserve these units. As far as the HUD Subsidized Housing, Los Angeles has the largest stock of this type of housing in any city in California or any state in the nation. This housing was built in the 1960s and 70s with 40-year HUD-subsidized mortgage, low-interest loans. And in addition, most of these units have project-based Section 8. And the beauty of these type of housing is that it also served as a vehicle to integrate communities. And because a lot of them, as you saw, are spread out all over the city, but they're also in affluent communities. We have some of these buildings that sit on Oceanfront Walk or on the shores of Santa Monica. But thousands of these units have already been lost because of the owner's ability to prepay the mortgage after the 20-year mark. Now we have more of these units as risk as we come upon the 40-year mortgage maturity date. And losing more of these units would be tragic and devastating. Houses are poorest of the poor, and currently tenants living in these complexes where Section 8 opt-outs or mortgage prepayments have occurred, for the most part are protected with Section 8 enhanced vouchers. And the enhanced voucher ensures that the tenant will not face a rent increase or be displaced. The enhanced voucher provides tenants with the right to remain as long as Congress provides funding for this, and the owners have to take these vouchers. The rent control law can also protect these units. We've been working to preserve these units for the last 26 years, and as a key housing department partner, along with CHPC and Public Counsel, we've been working to develop preservation strategies. And as you saw here over the last couple of years, under one of the HCD grants, we outreached and provided education to over 8,000 households that were living in units that were at risk. HUD also provides us with a contract to provide similar tenant outreach under our current 3-year HUD grant, which is the largest in the nation, and CHPC is a subcontractor. HUD has assigned us 31 properties at 69 sites containing nearly 1,800 units. 75% of those units are in the city of Los Angeles. And just to show you how outreach can be used as a tool. Thus far under this grant, we've been successful in preserving 11 of these properties with 720 units in it. And we've done this by getting owners to agree to 5 and 20-year Section 8 contract renewals, using the tax credit program, having them apply for the HUD's Senior Preservation Rent Assistant contract, and helping to facilitate sales to preservation buyers. Without this outreach work, provided with these grants, owners would not know what their options are, and most tenants would not know what their rights are, and likely that would lead to them being unnecessarily displaced. We'd see illegal evictions and poor housing conditions.
What rights do tenants have? I'm curious. What rights do the tenants have?
Well, the tenants have the right to, if there's a prepayment or an opt-out, they're eligible for the enhanced voucher, which gives them the right to remain. But a lot of times we found that owners try and undermine that and get them out. And by stepping in there and ensuring their rights, we've been able to protect their homes and keep the roof over their heads. But what's really important to note in this program and the funding is that all of it has come from outside sources, mainly the Macarthur Foundation and HUD. But this funding has provided the best bang for the buck in preserving this affordable housing, but the funding is coming to an end soon. It's going to be gone. And thus, if there's not a commitment to providing funding to continue this work, these units will be lost. Unfortunately, it's all about the money and the resources and staff that comes with that, and it's important that this programs be prioritized and that the money and the resources be put behind them. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, council members. Most of what I could say has been said, so I'll make a few quick remarks to fill in a couple places. First of all, California Housing Partnership, we're a private nonprofit consulting firm. We're statewide, and actually we were chartered by the legislature, the only nonprofit ever chartered by the legislature, specifically back in the 80s to address the what was then a looming affordability crisis. It was the first privately owned affordable housing being able to get out of the programs. And we've been proud to be a consultant and a partner to the city over the last going on over 15 years, looking at helping to work on various strategies on preservation. I've been talking about preservation for the 15 years I've been with California Housing Partnership, and it seems to me that a couple of observations. One, it's easy to run up the red flag and say, well, the redcoats are coming and everybody's going to opt out. And I think that in the federal universe that we were talking about, the federally assisted properties with Section 8, that has to be tempered a bit by the fact that many owners can and do renew. And I think that's where the fact that there have been so relatively few opt-outs from the Section 8 program over the years in the city of LA is a testament to both the work that CES has done and that city staff has done and that council did in actually creating a housing preservation coordinator position. Because the city of LA has one of the best and most integrated and forward-looking pieces of infrastructure to deal with expiring affordable housing out there, bar none. In coming over here, I was thinking about, well, what's different today? And what's different today is we're talking about, we were actually engaged with the city under the prior Macarthur Grant to do a study mainly of the federally assisted properties. And what's different today is this slice of CRA-assisted units. And I can tell you, I think you've all referred to it in different ways, but those are going to be the hard ones to preserve. And they'll be difficult and they'll be expensive. Not relative to building new units, but relative to other preservation strategies. And the main and simple reason, I think, are twofold. One, the city, this probably isn't true with all properties, but with many, the city probably doesn't have other hooks. There are probably not overlapping affordability covenants. But secondly, a lot of these units are a small slice out of a larger market rate property. So, owner came to the city 30 years ago and said, city, I want you to issue tax-exempt bonds. In exchange for doing that, I'll set aside 20% of my units as affordable. I'll do that for 30 years. And when I'm done, you go away. The time has come, and they have essentially a large, nice market rate property with a swimming pool and a weight room and all that stuff, and 20% of those units are affordable. Those are the tough ones. And I think getting back to what Larry was saying and what Helmy was referencing earlier, those also tend to be the units in the nicer areas and the ones that will be more expensive to preserve, but from a socioeconomic equity point of view are very important to preserve.
On that point, Mr. Chair, if it's okay, how do you quantify, you said it's more expensive to build relative to sort of the preservation of that tranche of CRA. Mm-hmm. How do you know? I mean, how do you perform the analysis to sort of be able to say, because I heard the figure of $365,000 thereabouts per unit, understanding that it's a unit in a development, and so there's economies there that are realized as a result of that, but how do we know? I mean, how do you draw the comparison so that we can analytically say, it's not that I want to cut bait on those CRA LA ones, but I want to know whether we should be throwing more money at those versus trying to figure out some other policy, whether, and I'm glad everybody's sitting down for this, whether it's inclusionary zoning, whether it's trying to incentivize, through some other mechanisms, the development of new projects. I mean, how do you know? Because I'd like to know.
Sure. Fair question, and it's easy to, and that's part of what we're engaged with HSID to do. Starting, we just executed the contracts in the next couple weeks.
So that'll be part of your analysis.
That's part of our analysis.
You'll make the case that it sounds like you've got a recommendation, and you probably have overwhelming evidence that that's the way to go. But you'll make the case that it's better to sort of go after those CRA projects.
It's part of what we're engaged to do is to perform that analysis and prove it out.
Okay.
And if it doesn't prove out, that's a different thing. I mean, but the basic math is, it costs, say, $365,000 a unit on average to build a new unit, and to buy another 30 years of affordability. The affordable rents are here, the projected market rents are here over time. There's an income stream that you're asking an owner to give up. They're giving up money over time, and so what is, in current dollars, what's the net present value of that money over time, and how do those figures compare? And then, step two, if that's something that's a recommendation that the department wants to make and that the council wants to entertain, step two is getting owners to sign on and actually do it.
Sure. Well, I'm looking forward to the analysis.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have public comment on this?
Yes, we have 3 cards.
Okay. Joe Donlin, S-A-J-E. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having this important discussion today. I really appreciate your leadership and appreciate the comments and presentation from HSID LA. SAGE and our partners within the UNIDAD Coalition, the United Neighbors in Defense Against Displacement, have been involved with preservation efforts and ensuring that new funds are created to produce or to preserve affordable housing. We have, through a community benefits agreement with Jeffrey Palmer and the G.H. Palmer and Associates group, we have an affordable housing grant program that we're implementing that we hope to leverage to create upwards of 200 plus units in the area there around in CD9. And through the community-led efforts around the USC's development process, we're helpful in making sure that there's $15 to $20 million affordable housing fund for the area surrounding the campus that'll begin to be implemented in the coming months and years. And so we stand in support of all of the efforts to preserve these important income-restricted and subsidized units. And I also wanted to emphasize one of the opening points that Mr. Cervantes mentioned, which is the importance of having a similar conversation around the rent-stabilized units, the RSO units that are a critical source of housing that is affordable to low-income members of our community. Those 638,000 units are critical to preserve, and looking at ways to, at the local and statewide level, to address the concerns around demolitions and condo conversions that is a returning issue and a growing issue throughout the city. And one way to be sure that we are familiar with what's happening around rent-controlled units is tracking the rent levels and the data. Without that data, it's difficult to have the best strategies we can around preservation. So appreciate the time to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Dana Trujillo.
Good afternoon. I'm Dana Trujillo. I'm the Housing Development Director for Skid Row Housing Trust. We're a 25-year-old nonprofit organization. We develop permanent supportive housing. We're also a service provider, and we do property management. We have 27 projects in the city of Los Angeles containing 1,800 units that house formerly homeless individuals. Most of those came in now under the category of what we call chronically homeless, so the most vulnerable, the most in need. I want to make a brief comment on the city's preservation efforts, but first I want to thank the department and the committee for its efforts to gather information on at-risk affordable housing. While the development of new affordable housing is imperative in the city, in order to maintain the stability that existing affordable housing provides, we have to make sure that we're maintaining it and preserving it over time. And I applaud the city and the department for recognizing this. I also want to thank Rushmore for commenting that permanent supportive housing has its own preservation issues that are a little bit unique, and for commenting on that you're going to kind of come back and talk about that. I want to bring to the attention, though, a specific issue about permanent supportive housing that I think is not quite categorized as preservation, but I think we need to look at it under the context of preservation. And that issue is that we have thousands of units. I'm going to read this because it's easier for me, and I know that makes it kind of boring, but I'll try to read it in a lively way. So that issue is that we have thousands of units in the city developed in the 1980s and 1990s that are the home of formerly homeless, disabled, and other extremely low-income populations that were developed decades ago. And while that housing may not be at risk of losing its covenant, the housing is at risk of going under due to lack of sustainable income. This is older housing stock that is in need of repair. A lot of it are buildings that are a century old, but that were turned into affordable housing and purchased by nonprofits in the 80s and 90s. So they're really old buildings, but from a development age, they're about 20 years old or so. Because these buildings house the poorest Angelenos, these buildings often have deferred maintenance and they lack the income and in many cases the reserves to deal with the necessary repairs to bring these buildings up to suitable standards. I specifically want to focus attention on issues in Skid Row where organizations like Skid Row Housing Trust, SRO Housing Corporation, and LAMP, to name a few, combined, we have about 1,500 to 2,000 units that fall in this category. Our organizations are not only providing the funding to bring services to the residents, but we're also having to subsidize the income just to make the buildings break even. We have income coming from older rental subsidy programs like Shelter Plus Care, which is provided through HACLA, but it's not enough to cover the cost of running the buildings. So just to put some numbers to this, to give you a little bit of context, just at Skid Row Housing Trust alone, we have over 900 units that fall into this category. That's half of our portfolio. So they're older housing stock, there's limited cash flow, we have limited reserves, and they're housing formerly homeless residents with severe and ongoing disabilities and health conditions, and we have high services costs. So while there's a recognition that there are high services demands of these buildings, we as a nonprofit have accepted that and acknowledged that from the beginning and fundraise and utilize other sources to provide the services. The issue that I'm trying to highlight is that the income we have for the buildings isn't enough to maintain just the normal apartment costs of running a building. So paying for property management, utilities, all of those things. About 700 of these units have rental subsidy, and the average amount we are receiving is approximately $600 per unit. For the 200 units that are unsubsidized, we're still housing the same population, and those residents are able to pay about an average of $350. We have a small handful of sort of low-income units where they're paying a little bit higher, and some of our unsubsidized units, people are paying about $100. But on average, it's about $350. So we're working with HACLA and HUD to help address the issues with the rental subsidy. But we need the city to be a partner in turning around the buildings. Types of assistance that the city could provide would include restructuring of loans, forgiveness of accrued interest, and looking for resources to help leverage capital from private and other entities. If we don't figure out a solution to deal with the physical and income issues at these buildings and identify ways to preserve them for the long term, the thousands, I'm not exaggerating, it's thousands of people who were formerly homeless or at risk of being homeless again. I think the first step in dealing with the issue is to include these types of buildings as part of the city's preservation efforts and begin identifying and quantifying the issues. The organizations I mentioned can't be the only ones that are having this problem, and I don't think the problem is isolated to Skid Row, although that's kind of what I see as a really big concentration of the issue. But I think there's a lot of housing like this that's probably all over the city. Second, we need a policy in place that directs and allows the staff at HSID to provide owners of this type of housing the flexibility and resources needed to preserve the buildings. I recognize that we are in a severely resource-constrained environment, but without the leadership and policy necessary to address this problem, and the buildings remain just as they are, the city becomes at risk of inheriting these units from the nonprofits who do not have the resources to continue to subsidize and operate them over the long term. Thank you.
Last, Adam. Colleen or Colleen?
Colleen.
Colleen?
Yep.
Of the council.
Thanks. Good afternoon. I'm an attorney at Public Counsel, which is a nonprofit legal organization that serves low-income families in Los Angeles, as some of you might know, and we maintain a specific focus on protecting affordable housing. We partner with CES, Larry's Org, as well as some other community-based organizations to do this work to try to save affordable housing. I'm here today to thank the committee for paying attention to this issue, and also just to make 2 points. One is the importance of preservation, which has sort of been underscored. I'll underscore it again. Increasing the total supply of housing in the city might marginally decrease housing costs, but for Public Counsel's clients who are low-income families, they really rely on restricted or subsidized housing. It's really vital to them, and as you know, there's many more families who are eligible for this housing than there are units currently. All the other sort of benefits of preservation, I think, have been made, so I'm going to skip over that, but I just want to point out that it's not always as exciting as looking at a new affordable housing development, but if we're serious about expanding the supply of affordable housing, it's got to start with preservation. The second point is just to say that tracking and monitoring and tenant outreach is really central to preservation. At my organization, we've helped a lot of tenants. We've helped keep them in their homes. We've helped to expand affordability restrictions on entire projects, and we've done that informally, working with city staff and HUD staff. We've also done it through more formal legal actions. All of that work has started with monitoring and tenant outreach and the efforts of organizations like CES. Without their efforts, we wouldn't have been able to do all the work that we've been able to do to expand affordable housing. So I just encourage the city to expand those, to maintain those efforts and expand them further. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to ask that we receive and file the report, and then that we move the next item to continue to our next meeting. Okay. Is that fine?
We're receiving and filing which two? Number one.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, is this item 2 you're referring to?
Item 1 is the one we heard.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Receive and file. Item 2, we can continue to the next meeting.
I understand, okay.
Okay. All right.
With that concludes the agenda.
No other business before the committee?
Okay. No general public comment?
No.
We're good to go?
All right.
We're adjourned.